All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, December 15th of 2021. I've worn my glasses for 2 weeks here now. First day back in contacts today, and now I feel like I look kind of weird without the glasses on, so it's funny how you get used to that. But welcome, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the chaos that was yesterday's slate. I think we were very lucky to have a 3-game slate rather than a 2-game slate, or maybe no slate at all for a little bit there. I don't know. It seemed like there were games were at least at some risk of maybe a postponement. Hopefully things go a little bit better. But if I had to guess, I would imagine tonight's 11-game slate, I think it is. Let's just go ahead and get it pulled up here. 11 games is probably going to be at least just as crazy as last night. So I will actually be attending the Denver Nuggets game tonight here. So won't be playing the slate, but pretty excited to see the Nuggets play. My first time going this season. But anyway, fun show on tap here today. We've got quite a few questions that have already come in. Let me see what we've got. We've got, navigating craziness, navigating late news up against luck, a couple contest selection questions, a couple questions about managing your player pool for both NFL Showdown and for MMA, and then a question about, let's see, I know there's one other one here on my list here. So another question here about like where to add, not necessarily where to add value, but how much value to add, and thinking about the things that SaberSim does well and the things that it doesn't, and so on. So we'll get to everything here today. As always, this is open Q&A, so pop your questions into YouTube chat, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and I'll try to tackle questions in roughly the order they're coming in here, but we'll go ahead and get started with the questions that have come in ahead of time here. So I'm going to start here, actually, with these questions about the size of a player pool. We've got it for 2 different questions. We got it for two different users ask kind of a similar question here. So let's go ahead and grab these. We'll start with LJ, since LJ asked yesterday. And he said, let's get into it. So he said, I'm curious, on average, how many players should be used in the captain position for showdowns? I typically play 3 20-max slates, and SaberSim had me using roughly 10 different players at captain. I was thinking of condensing down to 4 to 5 captains max to get a better mix of lineups at flex. And this is a good question. And I think it allows me a little bit of a chance to talk about something that I think in general traditional tools don't deal with very well, again, because they're just optimizing by average projection. If you get 10 players in a pool of 60 lineups for a contest, right, it just so happens that the projections work out that way. Because we're optimizing for upside and using these single game simulations here to build these lineups, you are going to get a number of captains in your pool that makes sense for the number of lineups you are playing, for the slate really in question here, and for the contest that you say you're playing. So if you're playing, these 20 maxes, I imagine there's something like this, and maybe you're building 60 unique lineups for these, right? And when we build these, we're going to get a number of captains in that initial pool of 60 here that makes sense for this particular contest and for this particular slate. There are going to be slates where one of the most common ones I see it is if you've got the Ravens against maybe a team that just isn't that good, right? Very commonly, you get those slates where you're getting probably a ton of Lamar Jackson captain. Josh Allen is another guy that you can get a lot of. Christian McCaffrey is another guy that where sometimes, you get the Panthers on a Thursday night football slate against like the Texans or something. And there's just not a lot of exciting players in the game, and you get a ton of one captain. In this case, we've got Chargers Chiefs, right? Which also is a great game tomorrow, which is pretty sweet. I didn't know that was the game we had. There's a ton of good players in this game, right? Just an enormous amount of good pay up options, and even like good cheap options that are going to be available to us here to play at captain, where we get like lineup constructions available to us that are, you get the opportunity basically to play like a bunch of big name players with a cheap captain or something like that, right? You see, especially when you have 2 good teams playing each other, you see a little bit more of this kind of lineup construction where it's a cheap captain and you get to play all these other guys, right? Assuming that scoring is all spread out or whatever. But overall, the point I'm trying to make is that there's not really a good rule of thumb here that I can say this is how many captains you should play. You should allow SaberSim to help kind of determine based on how many lineups you're playing, what contests you're playing, and what the slate looks like, what that is for you. Now, there is nothing wrong with intentionally condensing down your captain pool to increase your upside and to basically increase your variance, but give yourself a greater percent chance of winning when you're right. Or even if just the way you think about the game that you would prefer to be more invested in 3 or 4 or 5, if you said 4 or 5 of your guys that you really wanted to root for, rather than in a pool of lineups of 60 lineups having 1 Joshua Palmer and 2 Justin Jackson and 3 CEH lineups. And the easiest way to do that, or the way I like to typically do that, is to just start unchecking some of these guys from the bottom. And all this is going to do is through the pool of 500 lineups we originally built, we're just going to sort through and pick out our favorite 60 that match what you've requested here, right? So you could do this the way I just did, which is basically reverse sorting the exposure and removing your lowest exposed captains first. You could do this completely handpicking. Like you could say, I want to play, maybe you've done your own research, you've looked into ownership, or you've got a take from somebody that you respect and think is pretty sharp. And maybe you say, I want my captains to be, I want to play CEH, I want to play Kelsey, I want to play Tyreek Hill, and I want to play Austin Eckler, right? Those are your captains. You can go here and just check these in. And what's going to happen here is I'm inevitably going to forget the names that I mentioned. But it was something like this. Now that's embarrassing. All right. Something like that, right? So we didn't get any Eckler. Maybe you want some Eckler. Maybe you do something like this, right? You get a little bit of Eckler in there. And this would be more, all that's happening here is we're going through and we're sorting through the best 60 of the pool of 500 to get there. And you can see we're not even really sacrificing much Saber score here or projected score, but Saber score is better for Showdown, right? We're not really sacrificing anything. We're just picking a different set of sims where these players are optimal. And we're also, the one other thing to note, I'll mention this anytime somebody gives me an opportunity to talk about NFL Showdown, right? The one other thing to note here is that these lineups aren't just generated by pure luck. They're not just, and when I say luck, right? A traditional optimizer that optimizes for average performance is just doing that. And when you get lineups, it doesn't say anything about the state of the game, right? These are optimals for single game sims from our game simulations. So when you get different lineups here, right? Maybe you look at this and you're like, whoa, CEH captain, but it has Darrell Williams in it too. That's kind of weird. That's not what I would expect. You can uncheck it. You can remove it if you want, but it's from a game sim, right? There's a game sim represented by this lineup. Actually, this lineup's crazy because it's also an Eckler and Justin Jackson lineup. I love this lineup because it's likely to be so unlikely to be duplicated. I would love this for large field, right? 48,000, leaving a bunch of salary on the table, 2 running backs from both teams, and also the QB. Like no one's ever going to play this lineup. Actually, I love this lineup. But you can know here that that there's a game sim that represented by this lineup. It's not just pure luck. It's not, if you're asking yourself, wow, how likely is this actually to happen? Well, they're going to play the game once. You're using single game simulations, and our 37th favorite lineup in terms of how often this lineup is optimal is this one. So anyway, LJ says, is there any downside to setting the pool size to 1,500, even if just for 1 to 20 lineups? No, there pretty much isn't. The only downside is the time it takes to run the build. So the reason why we set this at 500 most of the time for most builds is just because in our experience, most users don't need 1,500 lineups to poke through and to go through or anything like that. So we do 500 to make the builds finish faster. But if you want to do 1,500 for every lineup you build, I say go for it. Just remember it takes longer is the main thing. For NBA, it's almost negligible. You almost wouldn't even notice that it's longer. For NFL, especially main slates, less so Showdown, but for main slates, you'll notice the difference between a 500 lineup build and a 1,500 lineup build. It takes a couple more minutes. So, okay, cool. So I'm going to jump then over to, again, a similar question here. And this one's from Chris. And it's actually kind of very, very, very similar, but we'll tackle it a little bit differently. So Chris said, hi, how many players should I use in my player pool for a 20 max entry MMA GPP tournament? I've been manually making lineups for the last 7 years, need to optimize my insight and instincts. I'm sick of losing because my lineup building methods are flawed. Yeah, so let's hop over to MMA. Do we have I don't know if we have a card this weekend. Oh, we do. Do we have projections for it up here? We don't. So let's do this. Let's go to last week's card, and we'll use that instead. So a couple things about the way I like to think about MMA. First of all, I personally don't do very much player pool curation here in step one. It's not the way I like to play. I want even the biggest underdog on the entire slate generally to be included in my lineup pool. I think it's very convenient saying that right now, and actually maybe very relatable saying that right now, given the upset we had on last week's card. But that's something that's true. Because of how valuable I think it is to avoid duplication in MMA DFS, I'm typically not doing a lot of player pool curation here. I leave it alone. So from there, I will do some things on step 3 to dial in. So, but first of all, let's talk about step 2. So when you hit step 2, especially for the first time, this is where you're going to put your build settings in. One of the things that's unique about MMA, and frankly a little bit unfortunate for now, is that we don't have our default sliders that are set for the contest that you are playing, right? But because this is a very high variance sport, and this is a sport that we need to very intentionally try to fade some chalk to get different, to get edge on the field, but also to avoid duplication, I'm typically very aggressive with the sliders I like to use here. It's not uncommon for me to do something even as aggressive as 5-10 here. I've come all the way down to 3-8, depending on the slate. Depends on the contest I'm playing. If I'm playing smaller contests, I might bring both of these down a little bit. If I'm playing a smaller card, I might bring some of these up a little bit, right? Because it's harder to get unique on a smaller card, but a 15-game card, maybe we do, or 15-fight card, maybe we'll do something like this, right? And I'll build, if we're building 20 lineups, I'll do something similar here. Max salary, again, this is something else that by default is going to be 50,000. I mentioned last time, that's the reason why this is coming up like this, is because these are my settings. Sometimes I'll bring this down just in an effort to get different. The reason I'm mentioning all this is because the settings you're using here on step 2 are ultimately going to impact how many different fighters you get in your pool, in your actual set of lineups. So let's build some lineups and look at this. So again, using a very high smart randomness like I am, you're going to get a wider player pool than you might have if you were building just based on average projection, no randomness at all, right? I want that. I want to encourage a ton of variance into my lineups. I want to be pretty diverse. I want to get very different. So let's see. I have a pool of, for 20 lineups, what amounts to 17 fighters. I do have 100% exposure and 95% exposure to some lower owned fighters here, or at least what we had projected to be lower owned. I don't know how these ended up working out, right? Makes sense. Ownership fade was cranked up. Variance was cranked up pretty high. Pretty wide exposures, I would say, overall. And this is typically ultimately how I end up approaching this. If anything at all here on step 3, I will actually end up doing a little bit to even widen this a little bit more. Mostly from the lens of, in a high variance sport like MMA, where differentiation is probably the most important thing, at least in large field GBPs. Sometimes I will kind of take the stance that I don't really want to have any more exposure to any one fighter than the most owned fighter on the slate. I'll just use that as kind of a rule of thumb. And if that was going to be Nunez, a lot of times I'll do something like this and spread out a little bit more. And I got an extra 2 fighters in my pool here, and I've spread out a little bit more. I now have 19 fighters in my pool of 20. So I will explore with something like that. So again, I think it's a sport that plays high variance, where fading ownership is crucial, and a big part of the lineup construction process is building unique lineups. So for all those reasons, I end up playing with a pretty high randomness setting, intentionally spreading out my exposures quite a bit. And that's my approach. If I was playing 150 lineups, which I have before, I almost certainly would have exposure to every fighter in the pool. Very likely. In this particular case, it looks like just one Kuchera is the one fighter I don't have exposure to in a pool of 150, if I was kind of taking this general approach. So I like to spread out, is my personal take here. And there's no argument, again, kind of wrapping this one up, there's no argument that someone could give me about anything that actually has to do with the MMA, the sport, of why I should remove a player from my pool. Personally, this is just my strategy that would outweigh the potential value of having a low duplicated lineup if I used that fighter in my pool, right? I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of fight analysis or like people that look into kind of the flow of fights and remove players from their pool for that reason. But if you tell me the worst overall fighter in the pool is going to be whatever, 5, 2, 3% owned, right? I'm probably just going to inevitably end up with some exposure to that fighter just because I know the chance of that fighter making that lineup unique is so much higher that it outweighs any MMA, the sport type argument someone could give to me of why I would want to avoid rostering that fighter. So that's just my take. That's my strategy overall. The biggest thing I'm focusing on is trying to avoid duplication, very similar to my approach for NFL Showdown. And that's kind of how I handle it. But so yeah. Let's see. Chris, I will get you a timestamped recording to this particular section of this video here. And if you have questions after watching this, just let me know. Happy to dive in a bit further. So all right, cool. Let's keep it going. I'm going to hit some of these questions that have come in live real quick from David. What happens if a late game is canceled after lock? Do we get a refund? Does the slate continue? Man, it's kind of a mess. DraftKings has all this stuff written out here. So if you're talking about, if the slate has locked, right? The slate is locked and a game just gets canceled, right? Very similar to a game getting rained out in baseball. My understanding is that you're just out of luck if you rostered those players. Now, if let's say you have, let's say last night we had a 3-game slate, right? Let's say 2 NBA games. If 2 NBA games got postponed, then at that point you could no longer build valid lineups, right? And the slate would have gotten refunded, right? At that point. The problem though is that the sites do weird stuff and sometimes are unpredictable. Like we had baseball games last year where a game would get postponed and DraftKings or FanDuel would change the lock start of that game to match the last game on the slate, giving people as much time as possible to swap out of players playing in that game. But that's also not something they did every single time a game got rained out. That was only sometimes. So DraftKings and FanDuel have all this stuff written out. DraftKings postpone game. This stuff is written in their rules, but they don't, to me, seem to stick to this very well. To be completely honest, let's go to NBA here. NBA Classic. Let's see. Postponed. Okay. So DraftKings says if a game is canceled or postponed and rescheduled to a time outside of the slate, basically, it's disabled from the game set. Players are not scoring points. Okay, so then right here, you can even see it, right? Like they basically even reserve the right to say by no later than midnight that night, they can determine how they want to handle it. So it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And I think with COVID too, with the unpredictability there, the sites are reserving some right to handle things ad hoc for these games. So, but Young Stunna says, I was playing NFL single game on FanDuel and couldn't adjust projection. I had to go with what it gave me on my lineups and play with exposures. I think the main thing here is that you can't edit the captain or the MVP. Let's see. So like this is not editable, but this is. So you can edit the projection on the flex position, and then it will automatically edit the MVP position for you. So I would give that a try. KC Chief said, when I'm making lineups and it comes back that I can't make lineups based on my exposures, me having 3 or 4 players, say at 50% min ownership, can I not do that NBA 20 entry? It depends on who those players are. What that message is actually saying to you is that of your first 500 lineups, we can't find 20 that match what you are trying to do. That's what it basically says. There's a few things you can do here to resolve this. I would say the most basic one, by far the easiest, is to just go back to step 1 and just set the minimum exposure to the players that you want at 50% to 50% here. And then when you build the lineups, you're telling the builder in advance, I want this, make sure this happens, and then it should be able to do that. If you know that in general you just want more of those players, but maybe you're not sold on 50% minimum exposure, you could also just bump their projection, right? If you just know you want a lot of Jokic, just bump Jokic's projection and you'll get more of them here. If you want to avoid touching anything here in step one, which is fine, I actually, frankly, like to avoid touching these when I can. A few other things you can do is build more lineups, right? Give yourself more lineups in the pool. So jump from 500 to 1,500, which is the max you can build here. And it's much more likely that we'll find 20 in your pool that matches. You can also increase the variance, right? If you have a low variance value, you're not going to get a lot of diversity in your lineups. It's going to be, your lineup pool is going to be less flexible. So if you increase your variance here, you'll be able to get a much more flexible pool of lineups. If you're doing all of those things, or not all of those things, but if you're doing some of these things and you're still getting the message, right? You're still continually, really what's actually happening at that point is you just are probably outright disagreeing with what the builder wants to do, with what the builder thinks of the slate. And if that's the case, then I highly recommend at least a little bit adjusting projections, right? If you want, like, especially if you notice these are just poorly projected plays, right? So like, let's say you want 50% exposure to Embiid, who's like relatively low projected, and you also want Jared Allen, and you also want Darius Garland, and you also want, I'm just looking at guys that don't have a good point per dollar value, right? And you also want Kelly Oubre or something like that, right? These are not good point per dollar plays. You're probably not going to get very much of them. If you want them to show up in your lineups, you should increase their projection, at least until they match other players in a similar salary range, really, point per dollar, to get more of them. But we can see here, if you do something like this, right, relatively high variance, big pool of 1,500, I would say within reason, you probably can set 50% minimum exposure to virtually any 3 or 4 players in the pool and probably get lineups that match. So let's give this a try. I mean, the exception is still going to be players that are really, really poorly projected, but in general, this should help quite a bit. All right. So let's just, I mean, we can even look at like poor, not even great value plays, but we could say, let's do Brogdon. I'm like totally just making it up. We're going to pick 4 guys and just see if we can get exposure to these 4. Brogdon. Let's do LeBron. Let's do Aaron Gordon. And let's do, I'm picking guys too also that we're not getting a ton of by default. Let's pick De'Aaron Fox. So, okay, so in this case, we did still get a message, right? So like this would actually be, so before we did the De'Aaron Fox one, right? Everything was fine. We were able to get the lineups. After doing the De'Aaron Fox one, it says we need more lineups to do this. I mean, the other option too, and I didn't really mention this at the start, is to just click yes. At least give this a try. And just say, yeah, build me some more lineups. And when you build more lineups in this way, it will typically try to build lineups that are intentionally matching your exposures, right? That will like basically force those players to show up. So in this case, now we're able to meet it. So now we're good, right? But had we not want to do that, right, at that point, it would be a good idea to go back because we have a high variance build. We have 1,500 lineups in our pool. We're still not getting what we want. At that point, it would make sense to go back to step 1, adjust the projections, or just set minimum exposures to these players in step 1 so that we're getting them in step 3. But the biggest value that message provides in general as somebody using SaberSim to build lineups is it is an opportunity to kind of check and recognize that at this point, what I am doing is in kind of direct contradiction with what the projections think is the way to approach the slate, or actually not even what the projections think are the best 1,500 ways to approach the slate, right? And that's fine. The projections can be wrong. In fact, the next question I'm going to answer, I'll talk about that exactly. The projections are not perfect, untouchable, but you are in direct conflict with them at that point. So Casey said, thanks, man. Appreciate you. Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one. And I know that message can be a little bit like confusing on exactly what the best thing to do is in that case when you first see that. So, but let's keep it rolling. Yeah, so I'm going to jump to this question here. This is a fun one. And this is from Sean. Sean DM'd me this morning. He said, hey, I've been watching a ton of videos to get up to speed. I have a 50,000-foot question. If someone is making adjustments to SaberSim lineups, outside of maybe tweaking a couple of exposures based on leverage, aren't you defeating the purpose of SaberSim? I buy SaberSim because it's smarter than I am and can factor in more strategic scenarios than I can think of. If I'm going to be contrarian to what SaberSim is giving me lineup-wise, aren't I defeating the whole purpose for having the tool? I'm assuming SaberSim in running its simulations and having sims for each game, that assumes a team winning by 20 or 10 or 1 and losing by the same, and how each of those impacts different players. So I don't need to do a flag plant on anything. Plus, my bias in any scenario can undercut SaberSim. Sorry for the long question. Just want to make sure I'm thinking about SaberSim correctly. Okay, good question. So I'm going to answer this question kind of back to front. The short answer here, though, is that there are definitely ways to add value to the process. How much value you want to add, how much you want to adjust, depends a lot on your personal strategy, your personal approach, potentially the sport. I will do a lot more in a sport like baseball than I will in a sport like NBA, for example. But there are definitely ways to add value. So let's talk about, I think, some of the more useful things that you can do overall and some of the less useful things that I think you can do. But probably maybe the most useful overall thing that I think is at least worth paying attention to, and Sean kind of hinted at it here, but I do think it's even bigger than Sean mentioned, and it's editing your exposures in step 3. One, Sean mentioned leverage, right? And I think that comes from some of the videos that I've recorded about my process. But 2 is about risk management, right? And looking at your overall exposures and how many lineups you're playing and asking yourself if it matches the way that you feel comfortable approaching the slate, right? There are going to be different users that look at this and say, there's no way that in 20 lineups, I'm going to have Jokic and Beal in all 20. There's not a chance I'm playing that way, right? That is, from a risk tolerance standpoint, that is far too risky of an approach for somebody playing 20 lineups. There are also going to be people that are going to be looking at this and say, there is no way that I'm going to play 20 lineups without having a core of 4 players that I have 100% of, right? The upside just isn't there if I don't have a core of 4 that I'm rotating the other 4 or 5 players or however many it is around them, right? That is personal risk tolerance. And SaberSim is going to build a pool of lineups mostly based on where the sim variance slider is set that we think is appropriate for the average player for the contest you're playing, but it is by no means going to work for every single player. So I think one of the best things, and definitely something that can make your DFS a little bit more fun for you too, is adjusting your exposures based on your personal risk tolerance. And that might mean for you, again, that it looks like this, right? This might be an adjustment to your risk tolerance. If you are a risky player that is shooting for basically maximizing upside. For a different player, your personal risk tolerance might look more like this, right? We're adjusting exposures down, spreading out our pool, something like this, right? And what I mean by that actually making your DFS process more enjoyable is if you are a risk-averse player, you're going to be very frustrated when 20 of your lineups are all sunk because Bradley Beal has a floor game. And if you are a more risk-tolerant player, right, you are going to enjoy watching your lineups more when you hit the perfect core. And I think that's immediately a very good way to add value. Working again, kind of backwards. I said I wanted to answer this kind of back to front. Working backwards here. Actually, one other thing before we move on here. The one other thing that I think is very useful in step 3 is step 3 is the safest place to make adjustments overall, right? So if you are going to take the stance overall that SaberSim knows better than me, and I don't want to adjust too many projections or ownership, I'm just going to make the assumption that the model is more or less perfect. I think you can still get away with making adjustments here in step 3 for whatever reason, whether it's finding leverage on the field, whether it's just because you don't want to root for a certain guy that particular slate, whether it's because you read a sharp article by somebody that you trust that's sharp in NBA DFS, right? This pool of 500 lineups, we typically call this a pool of 500 viable lineups for the contest. And while there is a scale of what we think are the best 20 based on our Saber score, you will see that, especially if you scroll down and just start looking at lineups that are even in your pool, you'll see that ultimately you don't end up sacrificing a ton of Saber score, even as you start to get relatively deep into this pool. And we think the entire pool of lineups is viable for the contest. So if you wanted to make some strong stands based on ownership or based on other things you were reading or what have you, this is the place to do it. This is where to add value. If you're unsure, right? If you lack some confidence, if you think that in general, maybe SaberSim knows better than I do, this is safe because instead of rebuilding lineups built to your request or to your spec, you're just sorting through and filtering lineups that were already built using default SaberSim, right? So if you wanted to fade Jokic, right? All we're doing is basically saying of the original pool of 500, give me the best 20 to have no Jokic. They were already built. They were built without that statement, right? They weren't built with like, you can't use Jokic in these lineups. We're basically saying, what are the best 20 that don't have Jokic? And it is a little bit of a safer approach here overall where you can kind of afford to do those things. So, but again, working backwards here, step 2, this is the least impactful spot, I think, of adding value to SaberSim. This is the last place I would touch, frankly, almost anything. The best advice I can give overall is to set your sliders at a point here that makes sense for the contest that you are playing. If you are playing multiple contests that don't all fit cleanly in here, pick something in the middle and rock and roll. There is often, I think, especially with new SaberSim users, this question of what are the optimal slider values, or if I found the optimal slider values, I would bink every night. We have backtested every single slider combination for every different kind of slate size and contest that is pretty much out there and set the default values to what we find are optimal for the contest. So this is not, I think, a very good spot to intentionally disagree with SaberSim or make a bunch of changes here. If we work back to step 1, right, this is where you're going to have all of your inputs. You're going to have your projections, your ownership, your team totals, all of that stuff. And this can be very intimidating overall, especially for a new player. If you say, how am I supposed to compete with SaberSim running 5,000 simulations for a game and know better than what SaberSim is saying? And again, the answer is that maybe most of the time you don't. However, there are situations that are inherently difficult to model. Last night might be a good example, right? And I think last night is actually an example of where the model actually excelled. I didn't play last night, but from what I heard, SaberSim put people on some very low-owned nets like David Duke and who else? It's the other guy that other models, frankly, just didn't even account for or didn't even bother to project. But in general, right, situations like what we had last night, where there is a 8-man rotation that is pretty unconventional and a team has a bunch of COVID issues and things like that, right? This is just very hard to project, right? This is a best guess at what we expect things to look like and break out. But I mean, who knows what this rotation is going to look like or was going to look like realistically? Maybe there's a coach quote that comes out that gives you some idea. Maybe the coach quote says, again, we're doing this in hindsight, but maybe it says we're planning on getting Bayron Sharp a lot of minutes tonight, right? And maybe you think, well, 20 minutes, right? On average, maybe I bump this up a little bit. Situations in general that are unique, that haven't happened a lot before, that are kind of murky or unclear are always going to be hard for any model, even one as sophisticated as SaberSim, to project. It's just the way it is. So if you are looking over time for an opportunity or for a way to start figuring out how to make adjustments to the SaberSim projections for yourself, the best place I can recommend starting overall is with situations where there is a lack of clarity, where things are unclear because of injuries, because of a player that's gotten traded or a new rotation or anything that just is new, that's relatively difficult to look at and to figure out what's going to happen. Those are the best places to start. So the final question I'll kind of tackle on this particular note before we move on is, I do think like a common follow-up here is, okay, what if for a particular slate, I don't want to touch a thing? I don't want to edit anything. I want to take the default SaberSim projections, the default ownership, the default sliders, and take exactly what I get and enter them in the contest. Is that okay? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think there are opportunities to add value, but there's probably no better tool on the market that's better suited to do that, to just plug and play lineups than SaberSim, because it is doing things like taking play-by-play game simulations, thinking about correlation between players, thinking about ownership, thinking about the variance of the sport in a intelligent way, and then building a big pool of lineups around that. What SaberSim is doing when you just press build is far more sophisticated than pretty much anything else out there, and it's getting you much closer to the finish line than you would be building elsewhere, where you pretty much can't afford to just plug and play lineups unless you just want to build a bunch of cash lineups. So, Sean, I don't know if you're here. I don't know if you were able to catch this. If not, I'll get you a link, timestamp recording that you can watch this back and let me know if you have any other questions. But hopefully that helps clear that up a bit for you. There are a lot of ways to add value, and I would encourage it. At the very least, it makes it a little bit more fun when it feels like you've kind of done something, right? But that said, that's also not... Oh, Sean is here. Awesome. Yeah. What's up, man? Yeah, I think it's a little bit more fun when you leave a little bit of a mark on your lineups for that night. So, all right, cool. Let's see. Let me get caught up here. There's questions all over the place. So, okay, so I'm going to now go ahead and hit the questions that came in the Office Hours channel in Slack, and then we'll get to these other questions that are coming in live. So this one is from TMB. Contest selection kind of question. He said, I have an effective entrance question. If you have $14, there are 2 sports to play, NBA and NHL, and I'm working till 7 and can't play the NBA main slate, but the 10 p.m. has a 3-game slate with $1.20 max with 20K entrance. So that seems like a pretty good contest to me. And the 3-game main slate, NHL at 8 doesn't have any contest with 1K effective entrance. That happens a lot, but you can play 41 lineups for $8 or 20 lineups for $20. Wouldn't it make sense to play the 41 lineups? Because one, you're under budget, and 2, you play more lineups at a higher chance of a good ROI. Yeah. So, okay. So I think the kind of root of this question is like, if you are stuck between, first of all, if you can't afford to late swap or you're not going to make lock, yes, don't play the main slate. That's important. Play a turbo or a smaller slate if you can find good contests in there. For the second part of this question, I think the root of this question is really, if there are no contests with 1,000 or more effective entrants, how should I pick contests if I want to play? Well, don't sleep on just skipping that overall, right? If you're deciding between, picking between contests that aren't great overall, maybe it's just not a good sport to play. But if you want to, or you think you have an edge and want to anyway, I think this is actually a good argument overall, is that if you're choosing between contests that don't have 1,000 effective entrants anyway, they're all going to be about equally as sharp. Maybe it makes the most sense to play the contest where you can get the most number of raw lineups down to reduce your variance overall. So yeah, TMB, I think you've approached this the right way. 41 lineups at a cheaper price to lower your variance, I think, is probably better than playing 20 lineups for $20. So without knowing other details about your personal contest selection and bankroll management strategy and how many lineups, I assume that 41 lineup contest is probably a 150 max, but it doesn't really seem to add up that way. So maybe it's like maybe it's the dime and the quarter, maybe. But yes, I think broadly speaking here, play more lineups at lower stakes, all other things being equal. So quick note here, just because I think this is a good comment. Lord Pie said, Sean, I can find it helpful to do a dry run of your research for maybe just a week, just to see if your instincts and intuitions are spot on against maybe what SaberSim provides. I think doing the dry run or a test build or anything like that, just to see what a slate looks like before you start touching anything, is in general just a very good strategy also. Then you get an idea. You can see what SaberSim is doing, right? And then go from there. The one other note I'll say on that before we like totally move on from this particular question is that SaberSim in general, especially with just 20 or even 150 lineups, is generally going to give you an angle or a set of angles that kind of attack the slate in a particular way based on where we kind of see a perceived edge, but it's often generally not the only edge. And if you grouped your 20 or 150 lineups out of your pool differently, you would see different edges show up, right? So that's another thing to think about there, is like the projections and ownership are one thing, but the actual final pool of lineups you get from your build in step 3 is often really just one of or a set of a few small ways to attack the slate. In reality, even just in your broader pool, there's a lot of different opportunities to tackle the slate in a positive EV way. So, but anyway, let's go ahead and keep it rolling. Question from Brian here. Good one about managing late news. So he said, I was curious with all the craziness in NBA last night. The last sim wasn't done until like 10 minutes before lock. How would you recommend we approach a scenario like that? I ran builds after last sim, and I think it hurt my lineups a bit, accounting for some increase in usage for Brooklyn. So one thing this is similar to what we were talking about yesterday. I wouldn't ever go about it and say there was news that broke 10 minutes before lock that changed the projections, that changed the slate. I swapped to react for that news, and my lineups that I swapped into performed worse than the lineups that I originally had. Therefore, I should not have swapped. I would never go down that route. We had the same question basically of like, I late swapped out of a lineup that would have banked the other night. Should I have not late swapped? Well, no. You probably swapped into higher expected value lineups and just got very unlucky. But I would say in general, you should never deny yourself more information when it is available to you. Especially in a sport like NBA. The information that is breaking up until lock and up until individual game locks has such a profound impact on the projections of players and the expected value of your lineups that I would do everything you can to try to get as much up-to-date information into your lineups as possible. Now, you have to set a limit here somewhere. For me personally, I never start building lineups any later than 10 minutes before lock because I don't want to miss lock. Right? That's the worst thing you can do. That's the most negative EV thing you can do, is what I always say. So I won't ever start 10 minutes before lock. But in slates that are crazy, like had I been playing last night, I was following what was going on up until lock. I would have waited to the very last second, like probably 10 minutes, 5 minutes before lock to do my lineups. And if you say, well, Jordan, my NBA DFS process takes me 30 minutes to start to finish. In a sport like NBA where the news is so profoundly affecting projections and what lineups are good and where the value is, I would probably challenge that and say that you are probably the value you would get purely by just getting the last sims that run, the most up-to-date news within 10 minutes, is probably outweighing the rest of your entire process that you're doing that's taking you 30 to 45 minutes for NBA. Now, this isn't true for every sport, right? In NFL, we typically have all the news 90 minutes before lock, an hour before lock when the final sims run. And there's sometimes some final sims that run the final 15 minutes or 10 minutes before, but it's rarely so impactful to the slate 15 minutes before NFL kickoff on Sunday. So in that case, if you told me my process takes 1 hour for an NFL Sunday, 45 minutes for an NFL Sunday, so I'm going to run my lineups with the kickoff sims that run 1 hour before lock. And if another sim runs 15 minutes before lock, I'm not touching it. I'm too invested. I've done too much work for my NFL lineups. I would say, yeah, great. I agree with you. You can add more value by sticking to your process and sacrificing maybe the final last sim, provided something huge doesn't change in a sport like NFL. Baseball is the same way, right? So maybe you're playing baseball and you've spent an hour up until lock kind of dialing everything in, getting your lineups in, and then right before lock, you get a lineup for the Giants who are playing at 10 o'clock Eastern time. And maybe you've got, I don't know, a different catcher than you expected, right? That's not going to completely flip the slate around and make you have to start over and rebuild everything at the last second to get the right catcher in for your Giants lineups. But in basketball, it really is that way. You can spend an hour up until lock doing everything, getting your leverage and your exposures and everything perfectly right, and end up in a situation that when why is it always Giannis that comes to my head? I don't know why. But whatever, we'll roll with it. When Giannis gets ruled out 5 minutes before lock, the more impactful thing you could do at that point is throw everything else away and rebuild and make sure you get a ton of bucks in your lineups, because that's how impactful projections are for NBA. So, going back to this question for NBA, here's how I typically approach it. This is typically what I like to do. I will do a build for every site I'm playing about 30 minutes before lock. That is basically just default build. I just rock and roll it. I just put them in. So I know worst case scenario, I have something that was accurate 30 minutes ago if I miss lock. From there, I will keep an eye on something like, I will either keep an eye on SaberSim and wait, what's going on here? Why can't I get SaberSim up? Oh, I will keep an eye on SaberSim and see like what teams have confirmed lineups playing in the early games, right? How far away, like, do we have confirmed lineups for every team playing in the early game? If so, I'm probably good to go. I will also keep an eye on the Basketball Monster player news and look, are there still players that are questionable in the early games, right? Is it safe to build lineups, or are we 15 minutes away from lock and Embiid is still questionable, right? I will wait to get news at least for the first 3 games on the slate, or the games that actually lock at the slate lock time, basically up until 10 minutes before lock, which is kind of my last call of like, okay, I'm building now. But if I build and I get everything in, right, 10 minutes, you don't have a lot of time to do anything. So a lot of times it's just plug and play. If I build and get everything in and 4 minutes before lock, then you finally get that news that Joel Embiid is out, the sim runs, I will try to rebuild again. And if I spent any amount of time adjusting exposures or anything like that in the previous build, I will happily throw all that away to get the most up-to-date information in my lineups. So for NBA, I would be very, very aggressive with getting the final sims in as much as you can, and sacrificing as much of your other parts of your process as possible, frankly, to get the most up-to-date information in without missing lock. Don't miss lock. I'm going to be sad if somebody comes on here again tomorrow and says, Jordan, I tried to get the 4:58 p.m. sim in for the Heat Sixers game and I missed lock. Please don't do that. But try to get that stuff in when you can, and sacrifice things like editing exposures or projections or ownership or doing your random process, whatever it happens to be in your Excel spreadsheet, if it means getting the more accurate information up to date. So Damon said, would you do the same for NHL? That's a good question. Honestly, I would be curious if we have any of my regular watchers here that are the NHL grinder guys. Curious what your thoughts are on that, because I don't play a ton of NHL. My instinct here is that let me think about it this way. My instinct here is that there are more high value things to be doing from the standpoint of getting correlation and getting leverage and getting the right roster constructions in your lineups that you can't afford to sacrifice in hockey as much. And there is less likely that there is like a turn the slate on its head type news that breaks right before lock in the same way there is for NBA. Right? Like, you might get a different goalie than you expected, but a lot of times that can just be a one-to-one swap. You might get a slightly different line, right, which affects the correlation of certain lineups, but doesn't so much completely flip the slate on its head. So I would say for hockey, I think the value that you would be adding by spending a little bit more time using maybe a sim that is 20 to 30 minutes old, 45 minutes old, to make sure your lineups are constructed the right way, that are well leveraged, etc., means that I wouldn't just throw all that away if you get a last second, especially if it's a last second sim that you don't even know the reason for why it's happening, right? I don't know if I'd throw everything away to get it in. Cody says, no, I wouldn't. The lines are generally set. I would only say if you have a reason to change, like the lines were shuffled at warm-up versus morning skate. Usually you can global swap any issues that come up because the correlations are set. I think that's probably, I would agree with that. I think that's probably a better approach. So, but I mean, again, I think hockey's going to have more late news breaking and more things that shake up than a sport like baseball. But for baseball, right, also a high variance, high correlation sport where roster construction is very important. I think is I would not sacrifice all the work I put into my baseball lineups because the Giants catcher or something is different than we expected 10 minutes before lock or anything like that. So Lord Pi said, don't throw it away. Don't throw it all away to get it in. Sage advice for all segments in life. Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I guess just to be clear though, for NBA, I probably would say throw it all away to get it in, depending on the news that is breaking. But like for last night's slate, for example, where it was basically chaos leading up to the 10 minutes before lock, if you had spent an hour fine-tuning everything and then something broke right before lock, I would have thrown it all away to get that latest news in because it's just so impactful. So, but good questions there. That was a fun one to answer. So, okay, cool. Let's see. Let's go check some of these questions here that have come in live. Let's see. Man of God says, what about the 100-man tournaments on FanDuel? Do you need to play a lineup that is like to beat a big tournament? You don't. You typically don't. And in fact, we can quantify exactly how different you would play these two contests, right? So again, these sliders, since they are back tested by comparing the lineups that you get with every single slider combination, correlation, ownership, fade, and sim variance for every contest that is out there, you can really trust these. So in a large field contest, right, the 150 max 50K entrance, right, you need to build lineups that are pretty well correlated, even for a sport like NBA. You need to at least focus on ownership fade. You're really embracing variance. If you're playing a single entry 100 man, right, you don't need to do some of that stuff at all. You can kind of choose between these two, I would say. But in general, you're going to build like slightly correlated lineup. I would say if you're playing 100 man, leave variance on a bit just so you get some different lineups, right? But you don't care about ownership. We don't really care about variance that much. We just get a slight bump here. We try to correlate as much as we can in a low correlation sport like this, and we go from there. So you're going to get very, very different lineups, very different looking lineups, building lineups here for 100 man single entry kind of tournaments than you would for the 150 max 50K plus type tournaments. So Jack says, how many core players do you think is good for a large field GPP NBA? Is there a way to group players together on SaberSim? There isn't at the moment. We are planning on kind of adding a functionality that will allow you to more or less create your own cores and then say, I want this amount of these players showing up in different lineups and things like that. That's coming. Right now, there isn't really a good way to do it. For large field, right, I would say I would actually be cautious. So I mean, like I'm saying large field, like literally large field, right? 150 max kind of stuff, the big flagship contests, maybe the clutch shot, since we're talking about FanDuel here, right? I would actually be cautious with getting too in love with a core because you're going to be playing pretty high variance. You're going to see that your player exposures in a contest like this in general are going to be pretty spread out. If you are playing a core of players that even if your core means you have 50, 60, 70% exposure to all 3 or 4 players, you're going to be that's playing very risky. Right, SaberSim by default is probably, we'll see here in a second, is going to recommend you play less risky than that. So yeah, you can see our most exposed player is only 53%. And yeah, I guess you could say you might have a core here of 5 guys that are in at least 40% of your lineups, but that's not really traditionally what people think of a core, right? And that's because to beat a contest like this, you need to embrace variance. And when you embrace variance, you get more diversity. Now, let's see. Now, if you were playing a 20 max, right? And maybe your 20 max is only this big, right? Now we're going to get a sense of a core, probably. We're probably going to have a player or a couple players that are maybe 100% owned, at least 80%. And you could kind of arrive at a core here very quickly, especially if you wanted to play more risk averse. So yeah, we at least have like some sense of a core here, right? But we could even actually like really establish a core by doing maybe this. And now we have a core. And this is much less risky for just 20 total lineups than it is for 150. So overall, I don't necessarily have an answer of how many core players that I think is good. I would let sim variance guide you here based on the contest you're playing. And if you want to play more risky but higher upside, play more aggressively with your exposures. Get more exposure to your cores. If you want to play less risky, spread out. Avoid this thinking of core players and spread out your highest exposed players. So Bryson said, didn't embrace variance last night with Cam Thomas, almost 100% exposure due to me way over projecting him. Easiest way to lose every single one of your contests. Yeah, that can happen, right? That's why I say it's higher risk, higher reward. I would say if you just looking at the slate that was last night, I would say my favorite place to take a shot by far would have been some Nets guy, right? From what I was talking about before. It was a situation that was inherently cloudy. It was murky. It was unpredictable. And if you said I took a shot on Cam Thomas because who knows what the rotation really was going to be, I would say like more power to you. Great. If he was one of the lower owned options for the Nets, even better. If he wasn't, I'm still fine with it. I think that was the right way to play, especially on a 3-game slate. Take a shot on by far the most unclear, risky, high variance situation position in the slate. So, all right, let's see. Cody said, I think you mentioned that this would happen going forward, but I'd like some way to customize what you get in your stacks. I've had situations where you get Viking stacks and you almost always get Thielen and no Jefferson. Some ability to control how much of each player you got would be nice. If I lower Thielen and up Jefferson, it would just add more JJ one-offs. Yeah, that is still on our roadmap. I know I know you mentioned this some time ago. We are working on a lot. We are excited about a lot. So that has gotten a little bit slowed down by some of our other priorities that we're working on, mostly around improving late swap and the entry editor, and also adding this cores kind of thing that I was talking about here. But I'll tell you like what we have planned here in the longer term kind of time frame. And frankly, with this being week 15, like this is something that we're probably talking about for next season at this point. But what we do want to do is we want to give you basically the ability to do this. So we'll build 20 lineups, and you're probably already familiar with the filters, right? So you can say go in and filter by Kirk Cousins lineups, right? So show all your Kirk Cousins lineups. What we want you to be able to do is then go in and set your exposures to Thielen and Jefferson, for example, and have it actually respond to that perfectly, right? So like, here, I'll show you this real quick. I'm sure you kind of get what I'm saying. But right now, if you set an exposure while filtering on Kirk Cousins, you're just setting a global exposure. You're not actually like doing anything, but we want to be able to say, for my Kirk Cousins lineups, make sure that 50% have Jefferson's, 50% have Thielen. So that's on our radar. That's something that we want to add. So let's see. Let's use an example. Let's see if we can track one down here. Not the most exciting set of quarterbacks showing up here. Maybe Garoppolo is a good example. So like we would like to at some point. Oh, I only have one Garoppolo lineup. That's not very helpful. Hang on. Let's look at the Lamar Jackson lineups. Is Lamar Jackson okay? I wonder if he's even going to play. Right. So you can go in and say Lamar Jackson, right? And I want 50% Marquise Brown and 50% Mark Andrews for these lineups or something like that, and do that. So that is something we want to do. Josh did say, yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm not all in on SaberSim. I can't build groups or set single rules how I want. So I would say, like, the big caveat to all of this is that your personal responsibility for what you need to do to build good GPP winning lineups is much lower on SaberSim because the optimizer inherently understands the full range of outcomes of players. We know exactly how correlated different players are to one another, right? We have a much more robust here. Wait, I'm going too fast. We understand exactly how correlated certain players are to each other. And we have a much more robust approach to ownership and dealing with ownership when we're actually building the lineups than anything else that is out there. So a lot of the traditional tools like creating player groups and creating ownership rules and things like that you have to do on a traditional optimizer, because otherwise you will just literally build cash lineups you don't have to do here. So we want to continue to move the app in a direction that allows you more and more control over exactly what those lineups look like. But many of the traditional features that you might have seen on a traditional optimizer are probably never coming, to be completely honest. So this player groups and what we were really adding is the ability to kind of set like cores and make sure that some players that belong to this group are showing up in every lineup you make. That's kind of what is coming here. But like a completely robust player group functionality like you might have seen on Roto Grinders or Fantasy Cruncher is just frankly never coming. It's not going to, because we don't think it's necessary. And in fact, we think it adds unnecessary complexity that leads to worse lineups overall. Leveraging the correlation data that we have from our sims in accordance with how much makes sense for the individual lineup, for the individual context, and relative to the variance and the ownership and all the other things that make up a successful DFS lineup, we think it's a way stronger approach. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. With that, though, what we don't want is people getting to step 3, seeing lineups they don't like and feeling like you guys don't have the tools available to make them better or to select the ones you do like efficiently. So that we do want to do. But anyway, so very exciting. A lot of exciting stuff going on. I think I got to everything. I think. Looks like it. That was a fun stream. We had all kinds of conversations here. Talked about a whole bunch of different stuff. We talked about size of the player pool, few times how that relates to sim variance, how that relates to the individual contest and sport you're playing. We talked a little bit more like contest selection kind of stuff here. We talked about adding value, worked backwards from step 3 to step 1, and talked about all the different ways that you can kind of think about adding value. Let me double check here. Yeah, okay. I got both of the questions that came in through email. I think we pretty much got everything. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. As always, I'll be right back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Enjoy the 11-game slate tonight. Hopefully it is not pure chaos, but I'm going to be honest, I think it's going to be, just based on how things have been for the NBA for the last couple weeks. So be prepared to late swap, be prepared to be building lineups right up against lock, but those slates often end up being the ones where there are the biggest edges. So enjoy the slate tonight. I will be rooting on the Nuggets, so not playing any DFS for me here tonight, but we'll be right back at it again tomorrow. Another NFL slate or another NFL showdown. More basketball, more hockey, so looking forward to it. Until then, good luck in your contest tonight. Take care. See ya.